I will now briefly introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak for our second panel. Our first speaker is Ariadna Michelle Gaudreau-Aubert, Executive Director, Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico. Our second speaker is Tania Rosario Mendez, Executive Director, Taller Salud. Our third speaker is Ruth Santiago Esquire, Comité Diálogo Ambiental, the Committee Dialogue on the Environment. Our fourth speaker is Carla Minet, Executive Director, Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, the Center for Investigative Journalism. Our fifth speaker is Yarimar Bonilla, Director, Center for Puerto Rican Studies. Our sixth and final speaker for panel 2 is Amaris Torres Rivera, Executive Director, Fundación Fondo de Acceso a la Justicia, Access to Justice Foundation. Ms. Gaudreau-Aubert, you are first up. Please proceed.
Distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for your invitation to present this testimony. Civil rights in Puerto Rico have been in peril for long, a situation worsened by austerity, inequality, unsustainable public debt, and colonialism. Disasters have brought us closer to a social and economic crisis that threatens the possibility of a future in Puerto Rico. 11% of the population has left in a decade. Relieving Hurricane María and its impact is a conscious attempt to transform neglected collective pain into an actual just recovery. Because we are a colony, federal and local governments share the responsibility to guarantee civil and human rights and to lead survivors to resiliency. We need disaster assistance to arrive quickly, ensuring accessibility to shelters and aid, compliance with civil rights standards. We need coherent planning, equitable access to funds, displacements minimization guarantees, and real and effective participation. Recovery programs should never be a blind bet on random and possible outcomes, but a strategized road towards a long-term sustainable recovery. Crises do not affect all people equally. Unattended emergencies have a cumulative effect on the rights of historically marginalized groups. Inexistent and flawed recovery statistics and systemic racism allow discrimination against women, Black, and elders through the recovery process in Puerto Rico to remain unaccounted for. Our experience at Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, leading disaster legal aid and advocacy post-Maria, and accompanying thousands of families throughout the island, signal to an unequivocal disparate impact on these groups. Nearly 58% of FEMA applications and 75% of the appeals were denied. 2/3 of the families that received assistance to repair their homes received awards of less than $3,000. According to the Puerto Rico Comptroller, between 43% and 80% of the works commissioned by the FEMA STEP program to Hogar Renace were left unfinished. On February 2018, the government of Puerto Rico was allocated $20 billion in CDBG-DR funds. Families who were not able to access FEMA, who were turned down or neglected by Tu Hogar Renace, applied to DR housing programs. Between July 2019 and January 2020, 27,000 families applied. As of today, only 1,500 homes have been repaired, and less than 300 houses have been rebuilt. In February 2020, it was estimated that between 15,000 and 18,000 families were still living under blue tarps. First response was characterized by abuse of force, deficient nutritional boxes, a delay in the establishment of disaster relief centers, officials who spoke only in English, and the militarization of response. The local government, otherwise absent, implemented a curfew that was senseless considering that it was people who assumed the first response. A few days into the curfew, a Black man was killed by the police in a clear show of force. Despite the major power outage that lasted for long months and its impact in communications, FEMA insisted on having disaster applications filed through hotlines or internet platforms. Lack of transportation and access to justice increased the vulnerability of low income, of elders, of families with kids, and survivors with mobility challenges who could not reach the DRCs to present their applications. Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico went to communities, interviewed affected individuals, traveled back to areas with internet access, uploaded thousands of applications, and later returned to the communities to hand down registration numbers so that those people could have a chance. Half of the population of Puerto Rico lacks formal title. Nothing in Puerto Rico laws or FEMA regulations require owners to register their properties. Yet, FEMA's incorrect interpretation of owner excluded thousands of families from receiving housing assistance. At Ayuda Legal, we researched, we created, we drafted a sworn statement to serve as the alternative proof of title. And with other advocates, we fought FEMA to stop them from barring assistance to families with informal titles. In the end, in June 2018, we won, but it was already too late. FEMA's reluctance to notify applicants about their right to appeal and to use this form placed on the backs of nonprofits the responsibility to let applicants know about this chance. Thousands of families lost the possibility of receiving assistance. This form recently became part of the new FEMA guidelines. While we celebrate the impact that this will have on other survivors in other jurisdictions of the U.S., we condemn that this will not have a retroactive effect for Puerto Rico, so that applicants that were unfairly denied assistance could have the possibility of finally repairing their homes. Moreover, and recently, FEMA's recoupment processes have become an actual concern for survivors who are still awaiting a safe dwelling. Lack of formal documentation responds to socioeconomic elements, such as lack of access to justice, insecurity of tenure, and land rescues grounded on unmet housing needs. Moreover, informal titles respond to a system grounded on racial oppression, slavery, redlining, predatory lending practices, which historically forbade Black people from owning land. Lack of clear ownership eligibility criteria has also been an obstacle for Black and people of color in the U.S. FEMA and other disaster recovery funds should abide by policies that promote access. It is our position that individual legal strategies are not a real solution for the title issue, nor is the federal imposition of real property regulatory system amidst disasters. Addressing informal titles in Puerto Rico requires a structural policy change at a local level that cannot be discussed or solved in an emergency situation. Although I don't have more time for this brief initial comment, I wanted to stress that first response application processes and eligibility criteria set the ground for equitable and just recovery. Addressing civil rights protection requires revising how these instances comply with principles of non-discrimination, accountability, and participation. And also the fact that we are here before this commission because we truly believe that we are in a moment that, where we can elaborate clear cross-cutting guidelines and good practices to respect, protect, and promote the civil rights of people amidst disasters, even of those people who are still living in a colony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Even though we had a malfunction on our timing, you were 10 seconds early. So te felicito. That's wonderful. Our next speaker is okay, I'm going to turn to pages. There we go. Our next speaker is Ms. Santiago. No, Ms. Mendez. Okay. So please bear with me. I'm malfunctioning. Please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Cantu, and all members of the Commission for this opportunity to speak about FEMA's role in disaster preparedness and response to Hurricane María in Puerto Rico. For more than 40 years, Taller Salud has addressed health disparities that often are rooted in social, racial, and economic inequalities. The following statement is based on expertise, first-hand experience, and data-driven insights. In the aftermath of Hurricane María, Puerto Rico was on its own, with limited capacity and resources to guarantee subsistence needs and social protection. It should be recalled that a major disaster declaration was signed by former President Donald Trump, but a sense of urgency and commitment to robust actions was missing. After days without assistance, it became evident that the emergency situation was evolving into a major humanitarian crisis. There was no electricity, no food, no water, no cell phone service or internet. Our entire infrastructure had collapsed, and our most vulnerable people were left to die in their homes. I want to be very clear. Federal preparedness and response to Hurricane Maria was at best mediocre and at worst genocidal. Before this body, Taller Salud would like to denounce FEMA's lack of planning and coordination, coupled with discriminatory practices that cost thousands of lives in Puerto Rico. In Loíza, a town that is majority Black and majority women, 53% of people live under the poverty line. Gender inequality manifests itself in a variety of ways, including poverty and lack of economic access, lack of housing, underemployment, lack of support system, and a high rate of gender-based violence. When emergency strikes, women are always at the forefront of recovery and rebuilding, but they also bear the brunt of calamity and are the most vulnerable at the hands of austerity, physical abuse, institutional violence, and lack of access to proper health care and safe housing. After the storm, 5 of the 7 domestic violence shelters in Puerto Rico had to close due to infrastructure damage, lack of electricity, and absence of support by the central government. Because police officers were acting mostly as traffic and supply guards, women were unable to denounce violent situations and were forced to stay in dangerous environments. Local news reports have counted 7 women murdered by partners or ex-partners during the aftermath of the catastrophe, but to this date, the Puerto Rico Women's Advocate Office has not assessed nor published validated data regarding violence against women after Hurricane Maria. All of this constitute a violation of women's rights. The decisions made by FEMA in the first 30 days after the hurricane had consequences we are still dealing with 4 years after the storm made landfall. According to 2020 census data, Loíza has experienced a 21% reduction in its population. That's a 13% increase from the American Community Survey's 2017 estimate. This displacement has in part happened as a direct result of FEMA's inability or unwillingness to expedite the relief aid process. More than 3,000 homes in Loíza were left without roofs or so severely damaged that were rendered unsafe to live in. Yet FEMA has repeatedly rejected federal assistance requests from residents because of regulatory requirements that aren't tailored to the geographic and social realities of Puerto Rico. In 2018, FEMA published flood mapping declaring 95% of Loíza in a flood zone, making it impossible for our communities to rebuild post-emergency as FEMA requires flood insurance in order to reimburse for damages. Yet those same lands can be swiftly picked up by private capital contributing to gentrification, resource depletion, and even more displacement down the line. This bureaucratic chain is not only deficient, but it is downright cruel and discriminatory. However, the immediate needs in Loíza were met with an immediate response from the community. Women specifically organized themselves, surveyed the destruction, and quickly got to work to ensure the safety and well-being of those around them. They rolled up their sleeves and set up community kitchens across Loíza to cook for hundreds of people. Our approach to human rights and the facilitation of participatory processes within and outside of our community allowed us to promptly address the magnitude of the needs and to evaluate the necessary adjustments to the best of our abilities. We did community censuses around town to better understand the urgent needs of women, men, children, senior citizens, and people with disabilities. After all, nobody knows communities better than community members themselves. The Puerto Rican diaspora was vocal about the human rights violations occurring on the island, and with the help of hundreds of volunteers, we got aid where it belonged, in people's hands and homes. Undeniably, since 2017, Puerto Rico's history has been divided in 2 chapters, before and after Maria. The atrocities witnessed after this tragedy serve as a reminder of our colonial status and the severe impact it has on the lives of Puerto Ricans on the island and across the globe. One thing is crystal clear to us. When the government doesn't do its job, people lose their lives. Since September 2017, inequities have harshened. Personal and professional opportunities are now much more fleeting. Social and well-being programs are even more deficient and lacking. Our communities and younger generations face the choice of leaving their hometowns at a rate much higher than before. Without a doubt, COVID-19 has exacerbated these circumstances, but the beatings our island took from the hurricane winds do not compare to the governmental abuse our people faced immediately after and to this day. It is imperative that the government learn from Taller Salud's feminist strategy and listens to community-led coalitions as it develops disaster preparedness and recovery plans. Our work demonstrates the power of community resilience and the importance of feminism as a principle in disaster relief. Long-term recovery efforts require investing in the women leaders in the communities. That's the way forward, alongside our communities, with our women on the front lines, prioritizing the collective, centering the voices of those most affected by the issues, looking for solutions and answers within our peoples, not without. The solution has always been and will always be collective. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mendez. We will now hear from Ms. Santiago.
Good morning, Chair Cantu and members of the Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the civil rights implications of the federal response to the impacts of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. This testimony focuses on the multiple efforts that numerous community and environmental groups have made to provide input to FEMA and other government agencies on the necessary transformation of the Puerto Rico electric system to address the disproportionate burdens that centralized, fossil-fired, import-dependent energy generation exerts on poor and majority Afro-descendant communities in the municipalities of Salinas, Guayama, Peñuelas, Guayanilla, and other municipalities in Puerto Rico where electric infrastructure is located. And the purpose of the testimony also is to highlight civil society proposals to achieve environmental and climate justice. There's more detail in the written testimony. More than 4 years after Hurricane Maria, a cursory review of the electric system casts a disappointing and potentially lethal tally. After the hurricane, the centralized grid with its poles, towers, wires, and substations largely running from the big fossil-fired plants in southern Puerto Rico through the Central Mountain Range to the north, especially to the San Juan metropolitan area, was stood up amid scandals of companies like Whitefish and Cobra profiting handsomely from dubious work. Another company, New Fortress Energy, built an LNG terminal to import highly volatile methane gas that is frequently inoperable and was constructed without the necessary authorization from the Federal Regulatory Energy Commission. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or an environmental justice analysis of how nearby communities would be impacted by this new threat. The Punta Lima wind farm was blown away by the hurricane, as was a utility-scale land-based solar array near where the storm made landfall. The AES coal-fired power plant in Guayama continues to spew toxins, contaminate the South Coast aquifer, and adversely impact the largely Afro-descendant population. The new grid operator, a joint venture created by Quanta Services and ATCO Canadian Utilities called Luma Energy, is lobbying to rebuild the existing centralized fossil-enabling energy grid with a historic amount of FEMA and other federal funds that perpetuates disproportionate impacts and environmental injustice. The government of Puerto Rico, while paying lip service to renewable energy, continues to push for the reconstruction of the 20th century system that overburdens nearby communities and has failed after each hurricane in the past 30 years. Governor Pierluisi, who took power with barely 32% of the vote, is asking FEMA to hand over $9.6 billion to rebuild the centralized transmission and distribution grid and add new methane gas-fired power plants, and not 1 penny for renewables. In 2005, Congress determined that rebuilding these lines over and over was not a cost-effective strategy. And I cite, electric power transmission and distribution lines in insular areas, including Puerto Rico, are inadequate to withstand damage caused by the hurricanes and typhoons. In contrast, civil society proposals put forward by community, environmental, labor and professional organizations, academia, and religious congregations are calling on FEMA and PREPA, the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, to invest the historic amount of funds to provide life-saving distributed renewable energy, primarily on-site or rooftop solar and battery energy storage systems, to enable Puerto Rican residents, businesses, and institutions access to resilient power as set out in the We Want Sun, Queremos Sol proposal. The proposed transformation of the electric system would alleviate the load on poor and largely Afro-descendant communities that are overburdened by the centralized fossil-fired electric system. in Salinas, Guayama, Peñuelas, Guayanilla, and parts of the San Juan metro area. But Puerto Rico's civil society proposals thus far have fallen on deaf ears. The EPA Title VI implementing regulations bar disproportionate impact in addition to intentional discrimination. In the administration of environmental programs such as siting and enforcement, we ask this commission to urge the federal government to earmark the historic amount of FEMA funds for on-site and rooftop solar and battery energy systems and similar alternatives to alleviate the burden of poor and largely Afro-descendant communities close to the fossil-fired plants. We urge the Commission to investigate the LUMA contract and the role of the Federal Fiscal Oversight and Management Board in its imposition of the LUMA contract and in the electric crisis that we are experiencing. The use of the historic amount of FEMA funds allocated for the electric system will determine the viability of Puerto Rico for generations to come and could be instrumental in achieving environmental and climate justice in the archipelago. And so you see that in terms of the electric system, the request here is prospective. It's because the FEMA funding is still pending. There hasn't not been a decision by the federal government. There is still time for this commission and others to weigh in and influence the decision and have the Biden-Harris administration fulfill its promises and its commitments in, for example, Executive Order 14008 that require tackling the climate crisis and also centering environmental justice so that the communities near the plants that, as I mentioned, are largely Afro-descendant communities are not overburdened by, continue to be overburdened by fossil fuel generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Santiago. We're now going to hear from Ms. Mitnet. Please proceed.
No, in English. Yes. Good morning. I value the opportunity to talk in this public briefing for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights on the civil rights implications of disaster relief, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. I hope that this becomes a productive forum in which we are not only heard, but that can be linked to solutions to the problems and injustices that are brought to your attention. My name is Carla Minet. I am the Executive Director of Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, the Center for Investigative Journalism, or CPI in Spanish. The CPI is a nonprofit organization celebrating 15 years of doing incisive investigative journalism, training journalists in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, and doing litigation for access to public records. We have a team of 5 members, 5 journalists that have been devoted permanently for the past 4 years to investigating the recovery process after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Given the time limits and that our reporting for the past 4 years is available on the internet and accounts for many civil rights violations, I will focus today on very specific backstage events that may give you an insight of the challenges we have faced as journalists while investigating the recovery process that show systemic problems we face given our colonial relationship with the U.S. In June 2020, the Health Department of Puerto Rico said to the CPI that it handed over to the local emergency management agency information about the number of electricity-dependent persons in each municipality that comes from the federal database called Empower Map, so that it was given to the mayors of these municipalities. But the information shared did not include the names of the patients or their addresses, because allegedly this information should be handed after the disaster because of an MOA that protect private information. Health Department said to CPI, this is a huge contradiction with the logic of preparedness and anticipating tragedies and deaths. And like all protocols suggest, moving people that are dependent from electricity before a Category 5 hurricane hits.
Ms. Minette, could you pull the mask up a little bit? Up.
Oh, I'm
Gracias, gracias.
In trying to understand how this information was gathered by the Federal Empower Map program, CPI journalist Elivan Martinez submitted a Freedom of Information request to HHS on June 2021, including emails and letters in which the Empower program communicated to officials of the government of Puerto Rico regarding the Empower Map platform, dates of training events, and the names of Puerto Rican public official participants, dates in which the Empower Map team supported the Puerto Rico Department of Health with situational awareness and IT tools to identify electricity-dependent populations, and action reports and the corrective action improvement plans for the program in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands since January 2017 up to the production date. HHS has denied our request for expedited processing, even though we are a press entity and qualified, and we were in the middle of the hurricane season, which established the urgency. And until now, HHS has not handed the information we requested, violating all due process that is supposedly guaranteed by FOIA. In a separate effort, we filed another FOIA request to the Department of Homeland Security, the FEMA, dated February 26, 2021. We had interviewed several FEMA employees at the Puerto Rico Recovery Office that had presented complaints regarding work harassment and had said that nothing happened with the superiors. In the FOIA, we were seeking all the available disaggregated data presented in the quarterly public report on complaints, notifications about labor discrimination in FEMA for years 2015 to 2021, including the data on the origin of these complaints broken down by FEMA region, state, and territory. The information request was denied because no responsive data was located. OER does not track complaints this way, therefore does not maintain such records. A few months later, an audit by the Department of Homeland Security Office of the Inspector General analyzed 305 complaints about sexual harassment by evaluating 7,000 internal FEMA documents dated 2012 and through 2018. It found that FEMA did not always adequately reported and investigated internal allegations of sexual misconduct, including sexual assault, unwelcome sexual advances, and sexual comments, and its operation in the United States and its territory. This information they use for this audit is exactly the kind of information we asked for with the FOIA. We persisted and filed another FOIA in October 2021 requesting a breakdown of the places of origin of the 3,005 complaints identified in the OIG audit. Still no response. In Puerto Rico, we have a constitutional right of access to information. Even though it is far from being perfect, CPI goes to court to file these kinds of petitions I just described, and we usually get the information within weeks or months. In my view and experience, the problems of getting information through FOIA are real and constant obstacle to our accountability reporting regarding the recovery process. I've been to conferences and workshops about FOIA in the US, and I don't hear these stories from US mainland journalists. I will jump in. Last but not least important, as you might know, for the first time, FEMA has applied to an entire jurisdiction, Puerto Rico, a provision of the Stafford Act on disaster and emergency assistance that was included as an amendment after Hurricane Sandy in 2013. Since then, it had only been applied to develop 2,058 projects in 28 states. It was imposed on Puerto Rico government officials by the Trump administration, as our reporter Cristina del Mar Quiles revealed a few months ago. Section 428 allows for reconstruction in a stronger and more resilient manner, but Section 428 states that if the cost increase after estimates are approved, municipal governments are responsible for the extra expenses incurred. In those cases, FEMA will not disburse additional funds. This has become a huge bump in the road, as some mayors have confirmed to CPI. Our requests for interviews to agencies like FEMA and HHS take weeks or more to be granted. When granted, or we get generic and unclear responses, we inquire about this issue. This is not a wailing wall. It is a brief selection of the challenges we have faced during accountability reporting in the past years, and shows, in my view, the lack of empathy, the absence of urgency, and in many cases, an absolute disregard by federal agencies for Puerto Rican issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Santiago. Ms. Bennett. Next, we will hear from Dr. Bonilla. Please proceed.
Hello? Okay. On behalf of Centro, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, I thank you for the opportunity to present oral testimony at today's hearing. We will be submitting our written statement digitally following today's procedures. Centro is a research institute solely dedicated to the study and interpretation of the Puerto Rican experience. We did not work directly with federal agencies in the management of disaster aid, but we have been closely tracking the impact of the storm and the challenges of recovery. Since 2017, Centro has produced 13 data reports and 4 annual assessments. We've documented displacement after the storm, the housing crisis provoked, and the impact of school closures. We also organized major events in Puerto Rico and New York and online, oriented towards capacity building and the formation of alliances across sectors. Based on these activities, our main recommendation is that it is imperative for FEMA to adopt an intersectional approach to emergency management in Puerto Rico and beyond. This entails paying closer attention to how various social and demographic variables, such as race, gender, age, disability, and geographic location, impact and combine in ways that hamper both individual and collective abilities to respond to disasters and access federal aid. This also includes a necessary recognition that inhabitants of U.S. territories face particular barriers which require FEMA to develop customized practices through local information gathering, such as the hearings today. We would like to particularly highlight the challenges faced by senior-age populations and disabled populations, as well as those living in particular geographic regions. In regards to seniors, it is important to recognize that seniors face unique vulnerability risks within Puerto Rico, including a lack of family support networks due to adult children not living in the same home or having migrated away from Puerto Rico. They also have lower probability to respond to disaster warnings due to lack of internet access. There are also particular socioeconomic characteristics regarding Puerto Rico's senior population that are important to note. Please allow me to provide you with some figures. In Puerto Rico, 22% of the population is elderly. This is much higher than the U.S. average of 16.5%. 40% of Puerto Rico's seniors live at or below the poverty line. This is again disproportionately high, where in the 50 states, the poverty rate for seniors is only 9.4% overall and 7.9% among Latinos. After Hurricane Maria, at least 1/3 of the senior age population applied for aid. By analyzing the data from FEMA applications, we found that senior applicants had disproportionately lower gross income levels relative to the overall population. More than half of senior age aid applicants reported less than $15,000 as their gross annual income. It should be noted that since Hurricane Maria, the senior age population has grown across municipalities. In other words, Puerto Rico's population is becoming disproportionately elderly, partly as a result of post-Maria displacement. Similar to seniors, people with disabilities experience particular obstacles and challenges in both the lead-up and the aftermath of disasters and emergencies. Again, let me provide some data points specific to Puerto Rico. 21% of our population is disabled. This is significantly higher than the average for the 50 states, which is 12.7%. Half of Puerto Rico's disabled population lives below the poverty line. This is again statistically higher than the 50 states, where it is only 20%. And these numbers have been increasing. Since 2017, poverty rates for the disabled have increased by 4.8%. Lastly, it is important to note that Puerto Rico's disabled population is not equally distributed geographically. Instead, there are various pockets of disabled communities, mostly in rural areas. In our analysis of U.S. Census data, we found that there are areas where as much as 100% of the population reported a disability in Puerto Rico. This is notably in the municipalities of Yauco, Jayuya, and Orocovis, all of which are rural areas. Thus, I would like to end by calling attention to the importance of geography. The impact of Hurricane Maria was seen across the entirety of Puerto Rico, And yet in our analysis, we found that it was only in the San Juan area where the number of aid applicants was proportionate to the population. Numerous studies have attributed this to FEMA's unfamiliarity with Puerto Rico's terrain beyond urban centers. It is worth noting that this is particularly concerning given the spatial concentrations of vulnerable communities in rural areas, as noted above. By creating barriers to access in rural areas, FEMA is also creating barriers for the elderly, the disabled, and other socially vulnerable populations. Lastly, I want to call attention to how living in a U.S. territory, as opposed to a U.S. state, inherently creates disproportionate access to aid. As numerous studies and previous panelists have argued, the federal response in Puerto Rico was overall slower and smaller in scale to what was seen after Hurricanes Harvey and Irma in Texas and Florida during the same period. I place this under the category of geography because in previous legal proceedings, other branches of the federal government have argued that Puerto Ricans are not the victims of discrimination based on race or ethnicity, given that when they migrate to the 50 states, they have full access to the rights and entitlements of U.S. citizens. However, it is obvious that the residents of this U.S. territory are disproportionately of Puerto Rican descent. And thus the lack of access to adequate aid in this particular geography must be understood as a form of ethnic discrimination, rooted in the United States colonial history and imperial present. In closing, I urge federal, state, and local agencies to adopt an intersectional approach to questions of accessibility and to pay greater attention to how residing in a U.S. territory predisposes populations to experience barriers to federal aid. Indeed, I ask if this federal commission gave enough attention to the particular challenges involved in preparing testimony in English and in educating the public about their right to testify and attend these hearings in a context where civil society is overtasked with filling the gaps of ineffective government response to our ongoing disasters, including not just hurricanes and earthquakes, but also the fiscal crisis and our ongoing pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bonilla. We will now hear from Ms. Torres Rivera. Please proceed.
Good afternoon. Thank you, all the commission, for the invitation to participate on this public briefing. And I also want to recognize the all-women panel that is right now at this public briefing. I'm the executive director of the Fundación Fondo de Acceso a la Justicia, or Access to Justice Fund Foundation. It's a nonprofit foundation in Puerto Rico that provides funding to diverse nonprofit organizations to offer free legal services on civil matters to low-income and vulnerable communities. After Hurricane Irma and Maria, our foundation created the Legal Emergency Fund with the purpose of providing free legal assistance to disaster survivors, particularly low-income families, that were in imminent need of housing assistance. Currently, we have impacted 15,000 families in Puerto Rico. We subsidized over 20 nonprofit organizations and employed over 65 attorneys and notaries at law that worked in legal brigades throughout the 78 municipalities of Puerto Rico, helping specifically with FEMA applications, affidavits, and eventually letters of appeal. What we saw was that 65% of our participants were women, 78% were elders, specifically over 60 years old. But we wanted to highlight, because we are a foundation that has to do with legal services, we wanted to highlight specifically what we encountered through our experience with our legal projects. One of the significant discriminatory practices that we saw from FEMA was the denial of specifically 85,000 individual assistance applications because of the alleged lack of home ownership. Till this day, it is unclear why and how so many cases were denied because of the reason people were not able to prove ownership. And after some legal evaluation from our projects, our attorneys concluded that it was an arbitrary and discriminatory decision-making process from FEMA. During that time, our foundation collaborated with attorneys from Texas Access to Justice Foundation, and other attorneys from New Jersey both having the experience of Hurricane Harvey in Texas and Sandy in New Jersey. And I always remember them telling me that in Puerto Rico, FEMA was requesting people so many documents, and it was such a different process from Texas and New Jersey from what it is supposed to be, the process of requesting documents, specifically because the Individual and Household Program Unified Guidance at that time had a definition of ownership and exceptions to document presentation that was never obligated for people to have a formal property title. And I also wanted to highlight this meeting in 2018 at the University of Puerto Rico Law School, where there were high-level FEMA officials. When I presented this issue about denials of land tenure or property title, I remember they were telling me that they don't know why it was an issue in Puerto Rico because they had previous experience from other US territories or jurisdictions with indigenous and tribal lands. And they made exceptions and they applied correctly their guidance. So they didn't, they expressed that they didn't understand why it was such a big issue in Puerto Rico, but it was. And a lot of people were denied their right to have that assistance to repair their homes. So we had a very disproportionate denial rate in that sense. And I wanted also to highlight something that Ariadna Godreau mentioned at the beginning, since she also was dealing with the legal brigades. When the Office of the Chief Counsel in FEMA approved that the sworn statement, that it was basically this very simple two-page document that included different legal scenarios, specifically about ownership, land tenure. It wanted to accommodate the social and legal context of the people in Puerto Rico. So we thought it was the right thing to do. So we were so happy when FEMA approved that. But I just wanted to reiterate, like Ariadna was mentioning, they didn't make that document available at the Centers for Disaster Recovery. They didn't notify any of the 85,000 people that were denied because of ownership that there was a new possibility to appeal with that document, and it was a real possibility for that. So we encountered constant obstacles and challenges from FEMA we thought that it was sort of like this active action and discriminatory action so that people wouldn't actually appeal because of the ownership. So what we did was a new campaign across the island, helping people again with legal brigades. We had to include psychological professionals in our legal brigades because the anxiety and the emotional distress that these FEMA denials were causing on people were very real. We had participants that expressed constantly suicidal thoughts, and we even had a participant that committed suicide. So, and I wanted to say this because when FEMA denies an assistance, it impacts people, but it also has the effect of killing people. It's something real. We saw it in our legal projects. It's not something that it's invented, right? It has a consequence. So I'm running out of time. I want to respect the time, but we continue to see the discriminatory practices after the earthquakes on January 2020. We have all the details of what we saw on our written statement. But I wanted to also highlight that one of the biggest obstacles that we confronted as well with FEMA is the lack of transparency and access to information. We wanted to have information from all the 78 municipalities of the denial rate, so we would target our legal aid and be more effective. It was really, really hard to get that information. They don't have a dashboard. It's not accessible. So I wanted also to highlight that as a part of the civil rights discussion. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Torres Rivera. So at this point in our panel, it's the most fun part. It's the question and answer. So I'm looking to our commissioners to see which types of questions or what kind of information they'd like to go over. Okay, Commissioner Adams, please.
Thank you all very much for your time. My question, first one, is to Ms. Aubert, Ms. Rivera, I think. Could you help me understand, you talked about the property issues. Is there a procedure here where you have a local property tax, some way where homeowners or people on the land are paying taxes? And did FEMA not accept any evidence of that as evidence of ownership?
Yeah, as per the guidelines that were already in place for the individuals and household program, as Diane Gentile was saying, there was already a way to prove ownership that included what you're just mentioning, like payment of taxes or receipts. But when FEMA came on the ground, even though the CFR stresses like a very broad definition of owner, they were asking precisely for deeds, title deeds. And as I said before, nothing in Puerto Rican law requires that, and nothing in federal law requires that. And I must say that this is an awful precedent, because since FEMA did this in practice, the Puerto Rican Housing Department implemented the same restriction, a self-imposition for the CDBG-DR funding. So we are seeing the same thing that we saw with FEMA, the same thing that took us 3 years to fight in the CDBG-DR program. So, this is snowballing.
Completely agree with what she's saying, and I just wanted to add that we always constantly in our different meetings with FEMA staff, with high-level representatives from FEMA, we met with them locally and even went to the United States a couple of times because of this issue. And we constantly explain to them that Puerto Rico has a Spanish tradition, a civil Spanish tradition when it comes to law. We explained to them the complexities of just that, and having those laws. It didn't work as it works in the U.S., and so it's different here because of our law tradition. But also there's a historical context of land tenure in Puerto Rico, and our foundation even commissioned a study, a socio-legal study, to try to explain why it's so different in Puerto Rico. For example, people are not obligated to have their titles registered in the property registry. It's not an obligation, right? So it was very frustrating because we constantly explained this, and what blew our minds was that not only the attitude was as if they didn't want to understand, they didn't want to deal with it, but the guideline had an exception anyways. They weren't supposed to ask for the title anyways. So that was very mind-blowing for us, the insistence of them asking for that type of formal document here in Puerto Rico.
A question for Ms. Santiago. You talked about you advocated for distributive generation, I think. I mean, my question is, do you think that's more economically efficient than having an infrastructure like you have now? And secondly, what would be more likely to enjoy a capital infusion the next time that there's storm damage? Would it be the status quo, or would it be distributed generation?
Thank you for the question. Distributed renewables, renewable energy in general, according to Lazard and other financial analysts, are now the cheapest way to generate energy. They're cheaper than new gas-fired power plants. And the specific situation in Puerto Rico and other areas that are prone to hurricanes is that distributed renewables work better, are more resilient, and require less reconstruction, which is what Congress was saying. The way the electric system is configured in Puerto Rico, there are lots of power plants in the southern coastal areas, and there is a whole gamut of transmission and distribution lines that run from the south to the north, mostly San Juan. That happens to be right in the path of hurricanes. Hurricanes come in through the east, cross the island, and take down the transmission lines in the past 30 years. I mean, since Hurricane Hugo, I remember, usually it's part of the island, not the whole thing, the way it happened after Hurricane Maria. But certainly, yes, those lines, that design is a very 20th century configuration, and the investment of federal funds should go towards something more resilient that will hold up after the next storms. And what we're seeing, very interestingly, another equity and environmental justice issue is that people at higher income levels here are rapidly taking up these systems. But it's such a small part of the population with the high poverty rate here that lower and middle income people, that of course correlates with race here, do not have access to that universal essential public service through rooftop solar or on-site solar, and something nearby that is not as impacted by hurricanes and storms. There have been studies, DOE, recently civil society organizations like Cambio, AIFA, that show the viability, the cost effectiveness of these rooftop solar systems in comparison to rebuilding the grid. And I want to point to an analogy here. So if you order something online and have it delivered, you probably don't expect to pay more for the delivery, much more, 10 times more for the delivery than the content of your package. That is what the government of Puerto Rico and FEMA are considering doing. Paying to rebuild the transmission and distribution system to the tune of the already allocated $9.6 billion, and they're asking for up to $14 billion, and plus adding new gas-fired plants, as opposed to providing the energy more directly. You can avoid that whole transmission cost by providing the energy on rooftops or more locally sited. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks.
Did you have something? Okay. Commissioner Clodney, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Bonilla, I think I said it right. I am so bad.
Bonilla.
Bonilla. Is it Bonilla? Yeah. Anyways, has the Puerto Rican government or FEMA, maybe this is for everybody, ever conducted a complete inventory of projects that would mitigate damage during a catastrophe like a hurricane? And if not, would that help?
Has the government conducted, can you say that again, I'm sorry?
An inventory of kind of projects that are needed, like in these small towns, to mitigate damage that would occur during a storm.
No, there's been some studies, but it's not been exhaustive. I don't know what the other panelists would say, but not that I'm aware of, no.
Would that help?
I think so, absolutely, yes.
That's one of the duties that Core 3 had along the process, like to have an inventory of the mitigation plans available. And incoherent planning is part of unjust recovery. One of the things that happened is that planning processes, for example, within CDBG-DR, they haven't even started. So you're already pushing people like for relocations, for like giving out contracts, a revolving door between the FEMA STEP program and the CDBG-DR program. But the planning process, the millions allocated for the planning process, that program hasn't started. So as to answer your question, that updated inventory, we're lacking it because of local governmental omission to do so, and also because like the way that the funds are being spent locally is not coherent.
I just wanted to, sorry, I just wanted to add that we recognize that the government of Puerto Rico and the U.S. government has a responsibility to develop these plans and mitigate, but we also wanted to recognize that those plans have to be with the communities. It's a planning to get right. Not only the input, an active participating process, right? So when governments start contracting, and we recognize the responsibility, but it cannot be just, up, down initiative. It has to be,
right.
right? Just wanted to clear that,
Clarify.
right? Okay.
And another question, since the hurricane, has FEMA come here and conducted an investigation as to how it performed during the investigation? Has it gone from community to community to see what happened and to see how it could be better prepared next time?
Not that we know of.
There was an internal assessment of some practices, but I don't believe it involved coming to Puerto Rico and talking to local stakeholders. I think it was just internal, and also particularly looking at how during the past administration, there were specific directives given to slow down certain processes, as I believe the panelists in the morning panel discussed.
Have you ever seen that document?
I've seen news reports about it. I've not personally received the
And
document.
you don't know what it was called?
No.
I mean, I'm trying to find out, because we can request a copy if it's an internal assessment that was done regarding Maria.
I don't have it at my fingertips, but I can submit news reports that discussed it.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. I remember that I think 2 weeks ago, I received an invitation, and my emergency legal aid coordinator virtually attended from FEMA. It was like a conference of revising internal practices, and she actually, it's included in the written statement, some of the changes they're internally making. And then we applauded, and we think that those changes are good. They are coming 4 years later. People died and left, that's obviously an issue. But I think it was about 2 weeks ago. I can search for the information as well and send it to the commission.
And perhaps a contact at FEMA that we could get a hold of. If you had a person there, they would probably know who to contact.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I just wanted to say that there are many OIG audits that point out FEMA's problems and HHS problems. So there are lots of them. And CDBG also, HUD audits. So they should be, revised. And I hope FEMA local office is watching. I guess they should be here, but many of these concerns have been reported extensively in local press. So it's not that they are not aware of these problems, because at least we at the center, and I know many of these organizations have submitted press releases during all this time, and they should know about their failures.
You're right. I just wanted to know if they were looking at it themselves to make change. I mean, you can know about something, but if you don't look at it yourself. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to point to the committee, there is a 300-page report published October 2018 by FEMA called Mitigation Assessment Team Report, Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico, Building Performance, Observations, Recommendations, and Technical Guidance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to spin around on the whole title issue. It was brought up in the first panel. I want to get some specificity to sort of, well, because we like that for the record. Couple things. One, when did you first bring, and this I guess for both Ms. Obed and Ms. Rivera, when did you first bring to the attention of FEMA the issue that they should not be just relying on deed for applications for housing assistance as a result of Hurricane Maria?
Yeah, sorry.
I think the mic, okay. Hit it. A little bit harder. There you go.
Okay, so yeah, I finally did it. If tech fails us amidst the pandemic, it's done. So we have to go home, right? So
No, we're in
I have
person. We'll just
considered
go
this
farther
on
away.
several occasions. So just like Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico's brigade started literally 24 hours after the disasters, and we trained 400 lawyers and attorneys. We trained all of the legal service entities that were out there. So we were a huge group. We started noticing this, I would say, like a week or 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria, when FEMA officials on the phone told us, why don't you get an instant title? And we were like, I don't know what's an instant title. And they said, that's something that we did, that they had in New Orleans, why don't you have it? And we were like, okay, this is not working. If you hung up, somebody else would tell you another and another thing. I must say that 3 weeks after Maria, a FEMA official told the people in Loíza, the mayor of Loíza, you know what, you can use this form so that people who don't have title, it's something that we prepare, they can use it. And we went to Loíza and we filed 1,000 applications literally in a day with a lot of pro bono attorneys. And all of those forms were denied, and then FEMA denied the fact that they gave the mayor that form.
Okay.
So that happened over and over again. So FEMA knew since the beginning that this was an issue.
Okay. And how much later did it take for them to concede in that meeting with you that they would accept the substitute verification, which was always within their discretion to do?
So that document was approved on June 2018.
Like a year later?
More or less, yeah. It was,
No.
yeah. But I have to say that we truly appreciated that the Office of the Chief Counsel designated this attorney that met with Ayuda Legal and our foundation and other nonprofits to finally approve this. And we truly appreciate it. But not only did it was a approval that came almost a year later, but it wasn't effective because it wasn't available, it wasn't accessible.
Well, let me ask you this. Did FEMA ever tell you after that, after the 9-month period, and after they approved the term form, that everyone who was denied previously could reapply?
There was nothing written. Maybe that attorney could say, listen, tell people to appeal again. I remember some of our attorneys in our projects telling us that at the DRCs, some of the staff, a low-level staff in the DRCs, would tell our attorneys they could appeal with an affidavit, with a notarized affidavit from a notary at law in Puerto Rico, which has to be a lawyer, different from the U.S.
Yeah.
And we started, all our legal brigades had one of the requisites of being on those legal brigades, whether they should be notaries at law, because
Right.
the way the conversations led to that.
Right.
But eventually, we saw that all those appeals with those affidavits were also denied.
What?
Yes, so it was that then the sworn statement was approved, and also many applications were also denied. So that was-
So they gave you something, but it really hasn't resulted in anything, and they haven't said anything publicly about whether they would basically wipe out the old denials and let people reapply again, because I'm sure they would say there's some kind of time limit or something that I don't know what's going on. So you're shaking your head, so just tell me. Wait for the light to go on. Try it again. There you go.
Because it never became an official guideline. It wasn't until, I would say, and part of my staff is here in October, that it finally became a guideline. Because what FEMA said is that they sent us a letter saying, yeah, the form is okay, but now please nonprofits do go out and tell people. So we were lacking also coordination from the local government. There was no way that we could get the names of the 1 million applicants. And since it wasn't a policy, there wasn't like even an internal procedure, and we trained FEMA staff on the informal title form. And it was the first time that they.
So they have the names of everyone who got denied.
Yes, they should.
So they could easily send out or give you the list.
Sure.
But they haven't done that.
They should notify people because of due process.
Can you send us where that new guideline is finally?
Yeah.
And then the person who you met with at FEMA about this? Okay, thank you.
Yes,
Hi, I just want to pick up on this topic again. So, as I understand it, FEMA was implementing as a practice, not as a legal requirement, but as a practice, proof of title in a situation where it was known that many people would not have title. Now, FEMA's own guidance does not require title. The guidance that was in place at the time that the hurricane happened does not require title. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So at the time the hurricane happens, FEMA's own guidance does not require title, but FEMA requires that when they're looking for eligibility, rejects a lot of people's requests, 85,000 approximately, is that correct?
Yes.
And you engage FEMA when you understand that this is happening and come up with an additional alternative, the form that you talk about. But FEMA, is that we have that right?
Yes.
Okay.
9 months later.
Not 9 months later. And however, FEMA takes no responsibility for communicating the alternative paths to demonstrating eligibility, knowing that 85,000 some odd have been denied, correct? And requires the not-for-profit community to take onto its back the responsibility of trying to disseminate that, in effect, there is a structural process of improper denials and there's another approach here. But because of the passage of time, many people have lost faith in, and having heard so many different articulations of what's necessary, many people have lost faith in that any additional effort is ever going to create a possibility of them having assistance. Is that correct?
Correct. We even had some participants at our project that had 3, 4, 5 times presented letters of appeal, and the 5 times were denied.
Has this degree of denial ever happened in another place that you're aware of? I understand that you're not all professional investigators of FEMA, but we have heard that there have been other contexts in which the title issue has presented itself. Are we aware that there's ever been this magnitude of denial in the wake of a natural disaster in other places?
I just wanted to say that we had to go to court for a FOIA petition in 2019 for exactly the database of the FEMA denials for individual assistance. And since then, we are still in court with FEMA for this information. They have been feeding us with irrelevant information, but still, this database have not been produced.
So, in light of what we have described here and reviewed with you, can you think of explanations for why FEMA is proceeding in this way?
Yes, I did it. So there is a piece that has been widely studied in other jurisdictions that have been disaster-stricken that has to do with disinvestment, and the way that disasters promote disinvestment of low-income Black communities everywhere. So as Diane Gentil was saying, this has also happened in jurisdictions as New Orleans, post-Katrina, with people with informal titles, and more recently with people with mobile homes in Texas. So the things that we were listening from FEMA, from high-level FEMA officials, and we have been more recently through hot listening sessions on civil rights too, which are very, of course, linked, is that there was a perception that people in Puerto Rico were going to take the money. That idea based on the fact that we were going to spend public funds without accountability, public fraud, and whatnot. And we have been listening to the same things over and over again in the past administration and even in this administration. So there is a reading, a racial reading of the people who are benefiting from assistance, where there is this idea that these people are going to commit fraud. Now that we are going through recoupment processes, and that's like another thing regarding FEMA, we have people undergoing recoupment process because they were unable to prove ownership, although they did based on the existing guidelines. So there is like a dominant imaginary of the way that Puerto Ricans are related that was expressed in social media widely by the former president of the U.S.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Yeah, first, I was looking through my phone to try to find some statistics, but I will submit them later about, in the end, at the end of the day, what percentage of Puerto Ricans actually received aid after all. I don't know if the commission has that, but it's in the single-digit percentages. And then of that percentage, what percentage received the maximum allowable amount? And it was about 1% or less. And I do think that what Ariana is saying, this is actually a research question that we need to look into to see if this is unique to Puerto Rico. And as she's saying, we need to also look not just at different places, but at specific populations within those places and how these denials and barriers to aid are disproportionately, distributed. And this is not a research that we've yet done at Centro, but if the commission wishes to commission us to do that, we would be happy to provide further, look into this further and provide our own, investigation upon this.
Certainly any information, comparative information about denials and the demographics of the populations would be valuable, I think, for purposes of our investigation and for FEMA going forward. Just to be clear, the guidance that we've been talking about and referring to, is that an interpretation of Stafford Section 408? I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to trace back to what the applicable law is that FEMA is implementing with this guidance.
It's 44 CFR 216, sorry. 44 CFR 216. I am confident that if I'm mistaken, the team will scream. So, yeah.
Ms. Rivera, were you trying to get in on that as well? Yeah, it's okay, and just for the clarity of the record, as far as we understand it, the statute itself doesn't speak to a title requirement.
What the statute does is to define who's an owner, and it goes into saying that an owner is somebody who is proprietary interest, is a person who makes like repairs and whatnot. And what we did in the form was to mix that with local law to demonstrate what a proprietary interest would look like using the local legal framework. And we even presented several white papers to FEMA as the legal analysis for that.
Which, as I understand it, is another way of saying that the statute itself does not require title expressly.
Never.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, I wanted to echo my fellow partners of this panel, but just wanted to add that to the point of what Dr. Bonilla was saying, and to the fact that Carla Minet is highlighting that we don't have the data yet, but we do have the hands-on experience on the field to know that women, particularly Afro-descendant women and elderly women, were disproportionately affected by this because of how in Puerto Rico home ownership is disproportionately in the hands of men, formal home ownership. So we don't have the data to prove it, but I would think that analysis with hard data from organizations in the field can provide enough data to support that.
And every research project always has suggestions for further research, but this particular issue is also an issue of a call for action. So if you just differentiate both and let us know which ones you believe the research is complete and which ones you think require further research. And Commissioner Adegbile, you have any more questions?
I'm sure I do, but I'm happy to yield to others.
Commissioner Adams, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Most everyone on the last panel testified that these problems that happened are interwoven with political status, one degree or another. In fact, Ms. Auber, your testimony talks about the colonial condition having something to do with this. My question is, you all must have thought about how status and different political status might have made the situation better or worse. And I'm wondering, for example, Ms. Auber, would independence have made the situation better or worse? What is the interplay with status and these problems in your view?
So lack of democracy is at the core of everything that Puerto Rico has gone through and is going through. At the same time, I want to say very briefly that as a human rights lawyer and a person that defends self-determination, I resent the fact that colonialism becomes so hyper-visible, and every time that we want to speak about any other civil rights violation, we end up on the status question and playing that ball in the field of the Congress. And that being said, yes, of course, the colonial conditions is embedded in everything that's going on. For example, what we're talking about is economic and social rights. And when we talk about economic and social rights, I always remind myself that the Constitution that Puerto Rico has, when we're talking about civil rights, when we're talking about that contract between the government and the people, has been denied of a clause that defends economic and social rights because the U.S. Congress decided to ban that clause as a condition to let Puerto Ricans have the political status that they have today. So the will of the people is to defend what we do every single day. Housing justice, land justice, economic justice, health, labor laws, and that has been taken away from us. Promesa, the imposition of an unelected board that is basically deciding over fiscal policy, and that's making decision of who gets to stay in our land. The question that we have right now, Commissioner Adams, is the future, the possibility of staying here. And we are being colonialism not only takes that away from us, but we are invisible. When we go to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and we have gone on several occasions, yesterday one of the leaders was talking about it, those are the only forums, few of them, where we have representation at international levels, because the colony that is not acknowledged by the United Nations because the U.S. has denied that right over and over on several occasions, is invisible. So talking about civil rights, talking about human rights is very far removed often from the policy work and the policy space that the colony lets us have. So yeah, we have to solve the colonial status. Yes, that's an international responsibility. But yes, the U.S. and the local government that has been complicit of the colonialism status has to repair, to provide reparations for the people that are currently asking themselves, ourselves, every single day, is future in Puerto Rico even possible?
Can I add very briefly to that? And I think that if the question is, would the FEMA assistance under independence, how would it be better or worse? I think that depends on the conditions on which independence would be negotiated. We all know that after the Treaty of Paris and the ceding of Puerto Rico as a territory to the United States, that there are possibilities of renegotiating that status issue. And the terms of that renegotiation would determine whether the FEMA funding or any other kind of federal funding would serve as some form of reparations for the colonial status that Puerto Rico is under with respect to the U.S. I also, if I may, just address briefly also another issue which has to do with the FEMA as a responsive agency, or lack of response from FEMA to FOIA requests. We've also experimented that for over a year, requesting documentation from FEMA and not getting one sheet of paper. With a multiple team of lawyers, including Earth Justice, the University of Puerto Rico Law Clinic, and other attorneys that we're working with. No response to FOIA requests from FEMA. Thank you.
First, in my statement, what I emphasized was the need for federal agencies to take an intersectional approach. And what I meant by that was echoing what my colleagues are saying, that we can't set us apart the question of status from these other issues. And so that's part of why I also emphasize that the discrimination that people in this geographic area face is an ethnic discrimination that needs to be understood in relationship to other ethnic discriminations and racial discriminations that occur in the United States. I also want to emphasize that an intersectional approach also looks at how these issues are compounded. And so issues related to gender justice, racial justice, they need to also be thought about in terms of colonial injustice, right? And how each of these deepens and strengthens each other. And in the case of the FEMA response, if we understand that the compounding effects of these disasters and of these inequities only sharpen these divides, then we have to understand how FEMA's response is not just discriminatory, but actually leading to an increased lack of justice for these communities. And so it has hardened the divisions of race, gender, class, and colonialism in Puerto Rico. And so all of these things need to be thought about together. I want to echo what my colleague Ruth Santiago just said about the need to discuss, what would be the terms of Puerto Rico's independence. And part of what is necessary is for the federal government to begin by acknowledging that it has colonies, because this is something that the federal government repeatedly denies. And so how can we discuss decolonization when we are not discussing that with an empire that recognizes its nature and why it has colonies, how it benefits from them, and how the United States is actually the United States and territories, right? And that is always silenced and never discussed. And so I think that to simply ask, would things be better if we were independent, is a question that we cannot answer because we do not know what that independence would look like and what it would allow us to do.
Real quick follow-up, but we can agree that if Puerto Rico chose independence, all of the colonial or decisions being made in Washington could be made locally, right? I mean, that's one way to alleviate the...
No, we cannot agree on that, because if you look at the rest of the Caribbean and in the independent nations in the Caribbean, they do not have, they do not determine their entire fates. They are also regulated and determined by organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, and also Washington foreign policy. So to kind of, just simply say, well, we will let Puerto Rico go on its own way, which is something that the previous administration had also said, and the previous president had asked, can we sell Puerto Rico? That doesn't take into account what that would mean and what independence means for former colonies. So decolonization is not just a matter of, a flag and a coin and a stamp and an anthem. It's about the possibility to create new worlds on our own terms with the economic and social principles that we think are important to our communities. And that has to happen in dialogue with our empire and with the global community.
So I want to come back to a point that Ms. Goudreau-Aubert, I think, was speaking to in terms of the perception, what you were discerning as a perception on some federal officials that monies were not going to be well spent, that they were going to be misspent, that there was a concern about fraud. Now, we think that based on the data we have, that the degree of monies that were approved in relation to the ones that were denied, particularly over this title issue, has a pretty serious disparity. But I wanted to ask sort of a broader question, because it's a legitimate interest for the federal government not to have disaster funds fraudulently used. I think we can all agree on that. Nobody wants money that is to help people that are in crisis to be misspent. But part of what I heard is that there were a number of contractors and others who seemed, A, not qualified to discharge the duties for which they were given contracts. Some of them didn't, in fact, discharge those duties and provide the materials that they contracted to provide. and in some sense, some contracts were vitiated or withdrawn. And are you aware of any fraud investigations that have gone into this contracting process of the people that the federal government awarded contracts to outside of Puerto Rico that didn't, in fact, do what they were expected to do?
So we did see the case of Cobra Energy, which involved actually fraud by FEMA in awarding a contract, favorable terms to a particular contractor by FEMA employees. And that has been investigated. There have been convictions. People are serving jail sentences for that.
And you said that's an energy contract?
Yes, Cobra Energy.
Related to Maria?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And separately, some people refer to a contract for a contractor in Florida or
No, the Whitefish contract was for a newly formed company in Montana that was from Whitefish, Montana, where Secretary Zinke of the Interior was from, and there's been an investigation on that. I'm not sure what the status of that is right now. But it was a company with no experience got a contract for, I think, initially $300 million worth of work. So it was very, very dubious.
not a rounding error? $300 million is not a rounding error, as I understand it.
And I think even more, as I recall.
Okay, and then are you aware of what evidence there is and what the degree of magnitude is of fraud that has been identified of people in Puerto Rico or in Houston, for that matter, associated with the obtaining funds, recovery funds improperly?
We have asked for that same data on multiple occasions, and they don't have it available, not even for the recoupment processes. So it's, as I said, a perception.
So no one would know whether there was more or less fraud here or in Louisiana or in Houston or even in New York City under Sandy. There's no comparison that can be had. And no one has ever been able to show statistics that more fraud would occur here than somewhere else.
The answer is no.
I don't think that has been shown, but what has been shown is the suspicion of fraud and the overburden that was placed on our communities to ensure that people were entitled to something that they were by law entitled to.
I don't have the specific data on that, but we started a legal aid project for recoupment, the recoupment letters received by FEMA, and we actually made the front page paper a couple of months ago with this issue, and there were 3 testimonies of 3 of our participants. One specifically of that supposedly fraud case was someone that was denied because of ownership, but then because of one of our appeals, they were able to have some money signed. That it's actually a woman, and I believe her children are disabled, and she repaired her entire home with those funds, and then months later or years later, she receives the letter of recoupment. And for us, that didn't make absolutely no sense, because yet again, they approved finally in a process of appeal. They accept the ownership documents that our lawyers were able to present because of the appeal. And then she receives this recoupment. So also we have to analyze how they are interpreting fraud, right? Because ownership is an issue. It depends how they are interpreting the documents that they are receiving for proving this ownership.
How did they, do you know how they determined to send the recoupment letter in the first place? I mean, what information they had that led them to believe that they were entitled to recoupment?
What I saw was a letter that stated that they made an error or mistake when analyzing the documents that were presented in her case and the specific amount that she needed to reimburse to the U.S. Treasury. Remember our attorney sending me that letter. So obviously it gives you a term to reimburse the money. We had another case of an elder that received a very, very minimum amount of Social Security. I believe it was like $600 a month. And another recoupment case. FEMA approved the assistance, and then he received the letter of reimbursing the funds, while the person doesn't have, it's basically condemning the person to live in extreme poverty, because they were also in the letter saying that they could retain from the Social Security check, which was like $600 a month.
So the recoupment, excuse
It's a
me.
very unjust, recoupment is a very unjust process as well, so, just wanted to say
Right,
that.
it's an ongoing process that's an appellate process, and
Yeah.
you haven't had any determinations yet, is that correct?
Recoupments are an ongoing process, and they have a statutory limit of 3 years. So what we are seeing right now is a lot of people like that have already received the letters. The letters are coming in English. That has to do with limited English proficiency. So they are coming in English, so people don't realize that they are undergoing a recoupment process, although till there it is reported to the IRS, and it is too late in the process. But we recently had a meeting with FEMA officials, and we requested a meeting only to discuss the issue of recoupment. And I must say that once again, how much they don't know about that. Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico posted a blog in our website that's not like a huge outlet of news. And a FEMA press official emailed us saying that we were lying about the recoupment process, that they were following the process. That was a very angry email, and we responded by asking for a meeting. At the meeting that was about recoupment, the officials that came, nobody knew about the recoupment process. Nobody could say who the lawyer in charge of recoupment process were. They couldn't say how a letter of recoupment process looks like. So what we were saying is that if people are undergoing a recoupment process, please bring the data. They don't have the data available, so we had to present a FOIA, and we're waiting on that FOIA. But also, we were asking them for everyone that has received a recoupment to receive, for example, the guideline that has to do with ownership, so that they could have a chance to navigate through the process, because case by case, it's never gonna be possible to reach all of them.
So let me just say,
David,
you
that's-
went through the whole thing with forms about Spanish to English a while ago, and now they're sending out forms in English to recoup their money?
Letters in English, yeah.
Letters. Thank you.
All right, I would just want to check one last time. Commissioner Gilchrist, did you have any questions? We're in overtime, but you're worth it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No questions in the essence of time. Just want to thank the panelists again for their remarks today. Thank you.
Last on this panel, Commissioner Yaki, and I apologize to the panelists for going overtime, but this information is so valuable to us.
So just one last question. It's just very specific data. If you have it, you can send it to us, but if you can talk about it, that'd be great. One of the things I'm wondering is, what was it, for the people who actually did make it through the process, how much was their average award from the federal government? Because one thing that we're trying to look at is whether or not some people get a higher award than others based on where they live or stuff like that. So that'd be very helpful to us if you actually have any of that information.
Yep.
Okay.
We can share with the Commission that the Center for the New Economy recently created some maps, and also people from Texas Appleseed and other organizations abroad are working in a map to figure that out.
Okay, thank you.
This brings us to the end of the briefing portion of our meeting. We're going to break for lunch for 1 hour and return for the public comment segment of the briefing. We were going to do it at 1:45. We'll come back at 1:51 Atlantic Standard Time. For those on the island still interested in joining us live to submit in-person comments, this is where we are. We are at the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico Law School, located at 170 Calle Federico Costas, San Juan, 00918, Puerto Rico. As a reminder, please, we have to exit this room for the cleaning protocol for COVID. Be sure you take all your personal belongings with you, and only your own personal belongings, because I pick up bags all the time and I go, where did I get this bag? Where did I get this pen? So don't be me. Enjoy your lunch. I'm going to see everyone back here at 1:51. Thank you.
Thank you.